So today we're going to work with functional integration, the Feldenkrais method, organizing the functional integration lesson for bending. And it could be bending forward to pick something up. It could be bending to pick something up off of the floor. We use this movement of bending forward to pick up items. It also relates to walking. So go ahead and pick something up from the table and so that we can see how you do the movement now. Yeah, that's good. Very good. Okay, so now I'd like you to lie on your back. And put your head here. So when we're giving a lesson, we are looking at the comfort of the person lying on the table, and we would like to organize the skeleton so that it's in a neutral situation. So I'm seeing that with this size of cushion behind Joy's head that it's actually too large. So I'm going to replace it with a smaller cushion. And now, when I see her resting, I see that her spine is supported, but her head is not coming up too far forward in relation to her chest. And now I'm going to place a large roller behind Joy's knees. And just behind the knees, and a roller behind her ankles. And having the rollers behind the knees and the ankles creates support for the muscles so that the skeleton is arranged more closely to how people stand up, because we don't usually stand with our knees locked. So it also allows for more movement through the skeleton during the lesson. So now I'm thinking of this movement of bending, and I'm going to impart that movement incrementally so that each touch is going to contribute to a whole view of how to use oneself in that particular action. I'm placing my hands on the front of the pelvis, and I always want to have my hands in front of my own pelvis. And the movement is tilting her pelvis, gently moving her pelvis so that her lower back goes back toward the table. And I look up, watching the movement of the spine all the way up to her head. And then I tilt the pelvis down the opposite way, which increases the curve of the lumbar spine, the lower back, and again I sense the movement of her pelvis, her spine, and her head. And I also, in my own image while I'm working, I think of her head all the way down to her feet, continuously having a large vision of how the person moves. Now, when we're practicing functional integration, we want to go to the other side and repeat the movement, because having done the movement from each side, I sense more of her moving, and I also sense myself and my own organization as I move her. This experimentation from one side and the other side helps us be aware of how we are biased in our movement, because we don't want to impart our own biases to the person on the table. So now I'm going to slide my hands underneath Joy's shoulder blades, more or less, and I'm lifting her shoulders simultaneously, and I'm sensing the way she organizes her chest, her torso, sensing that her right shoulder comes forward more easily than the left one. And we make small movements so that we sensitize the person. We actually are organizing the nervous system. And if I support here for a little longer, then she starts reducing the muscular effort. I slowly bring the shoulders back to the table and remove my hands. And I'm already seeing her breathing is expanding, her shoulders are widening. And now I'm going to put my fingertips behind her upper back. And I'm touching the vertebrae on either side of the spinous process. And there are grooves that you can sense with your index finger and your middle finger. It depends on how you're organized. Sometimes we touch with 2 pads, sometimes it's 1 pad. So every practitioner has to organize themselves so that they're most efficiently supporting the person that's on the table. And I lift the upper back away from the table with the idea of folding forward a little bit, thinking of the larger movement of bending. And I go with what she's presenting, so I sense again, like the right shoulder coming forward, the spine also lifts more easily on the right side. So we follow the pattern of movement that's subtly presented by the skeleton. Of course, that's driven by the nervous system. I'm going to lift her head for a moment gently, and again, that's as if she were looking down in the direction of her belly or her knees. And now I'll take hold of her right arm at the wrist, supporting her hand, and at the elbow so that her hand comes up through the midline. It's the easiest trajectory for the hand to move. And I'm going to take her arm over her chest and rest it there for a moment. Now my hand comes behind her shoulder again, and I'm going to lift her shoulder and very gently press her arm, her elbow toward her chest. And you see, again, we're folding, thinking of bending forward. Supporting her arm in a very neutral way so that her elbow's supported, her wrist is supported, and then I bring it back down and have her rest her arm. I'm going to go back to this movement in the upper back. Lift gently the spine and sense how her spine, her head, her chest is moving. And I think of that larger movement of bending forward. And now we'll repeat that movement with the left hand and arm. By supporting the elbow and the wrist, the person feels confident that they are being supported, so they can reduce the effort in their muscles and let go of their control of their movement. And that's actually a very unusual experience for people. It's not common that people give over their self-control like this to another person. In fact, most of us haven't done that since we were babies. So we'll repeat this movement. My left hand now is behind her shoulder. I have her shoulder blade, the ribs on the left upper side. And I'm aware of how she moves differently with her left hand on her chest compared to the right hand on her chest. And we're not trying to make things symmetrical. Everyone is different on the two sides. Instead, the focus of every lesson is to keep in mind the functionality of the lesson. So the function, again, is bending forward, reaching down, picking something up. So I lift again and sense how is her chest moving, her spine. And see, every lesson emerges as we work with the person because we are in a nonverbal dialogue with the person on the table. So as I sense joy, I'm inspired to put my hands on her chest and to say, hey, you know, your ribs can move a little bit more along with your shoulders and your arms. So I'm sensing the ribs on either side of the sternum, the breastbone. And you can see a difference in her breathing. She's breathing more fully in her belly. And we can move slowly up the chest along the edges of the sternum. And I do my best to match the way she is organized. So my hands are not symmetrically placed, they're slightly different with the left hand, a little bit closer to her chin than the right one. But I'm sensing this very subtle twist in her whole system. And by honoring the way that each individual is organized, the person never feels as though you're doing something to them. Instead, they feel supported. So here again, my hands are on either side of the lower ribs, and I'm very gently bringing them slightly toward each other and then down in the direction of the pelvis. And now I'm bringing her ribs a little bit toward each other and lifting. So it's a combination of taking over the work of the muscles, the unnecessary work that we call parasitic muscular action, and giving her a movement message through the touch, through the skeleton, of being able to bend more easily. And you may see now that when I lift her shoulders, more of her chest, more of her rib basket is moving. So now I'm going to move down to her legs. And I'm interested in the movement from her feet up to her hips, her pelvis, all the way up to her head. So again, it's a subtle movement, but she's sensing the movement all the way up to her head. And by making a small movement, she actually pays attention more because the movement is not overwhelming. So she stays with the pleasure of the movement. Now, we could actually stay with very small movements and continue by working with primarily the pelvis and the torso, but I'm going to bring in some larger movements now. And so I'm going to lift her leg and bring her knee up a little bit and sense the movement in her hip joint. And as we do that, I'm aware of her pelvis and how this movement bends her spine. And now I'm going to go to the other leg. And again, sense the movement of her knee bending, how her pelvis responds. And I'm making a little circle here to differentiate the movement of her hip joint as her knee goes toward her chest. And as you're giving a lesson of this kind, you'll probably sense that one knee goes up easier than the other one. And that's normal, it's natural. We all move differently on the two sides. So after taking her knees toward her chest, I'm going to go back to the movement of her feet and see how the line of force from her feet through her legs to her pelvis is responding. And I can see and sense that the movement's easier. So we're very gentle and precise even when we make a movement like this of rocking the pelvis through the bottom of the foot. Now, when I'm putting my hand on her foot like this, there's a very specific spot that we put the thumb, and that's just in front of the heel and a little bit to the inside, because the line of force then goes directly through the leg, the knee, the hip joint to the pelvis and all the way up to the head. And if we just willy-nilly start to press on the foot, you see you create all different kinds of action that creates a fuzzy movement message. So we want to have a really clear, dynamic movement message every time we put our hands on another person. So I'm going to remove the fuzzy movement of the ball of the foot by repeating this gently. And now we'll go back to connecting. We're going to connect now the upper part of the torso to the lower part of the pelvis and even the leg by bringing the hand just below the knee. So the way that we place the hand below the knee is a continuation of the line from the shoulder all the way up to the hand to just below the knee. And this way, we're not torquing the wrist or twisting the shoulder, but there's a continuous circle. And then I support her hand, I support her wrist, and I'm going to make a circle with her knee that translates to her shoulder. So her ribs are moving, her arm, her shoulder, her left hip joint is moving. And you may see that as I circle her in this way that I circle too. So I'm actually circling my pelvis and supporting her movement with my entire skeleton. And then I slowly bring her elbow back down to the table, rest, lengthen her leg. So every movement that we do is methodical, it's sensitive, because we want to create trust between the two of us. It's a nonverbal dialogue. So we're repeating this movement of making a circle with the knee, the shoulder circling. I'm observing her whole self, her chest, her ribs moving, her head's moving a little bit. And then we go the opposite way. And then I'm slowly lowering her hand to her belly, lengthening her leg. So again, the lesson is emerging, and If you're giving someone a lesson that's never had a lesson before, you might describe to them that you're now going to lift their leg or you're going to bring their hand to their knee so they have an understanding of what you're doing, because it could be a brand new experience and it might seem quite unusual to be moved in this way because they've never experienced it before. So someone like Joy, who's had many lessons, knows how to rest fully and give me the ability to move her freely. But if somebody's having a lesson again for the first time, they have to learn how to receive a lesson. And I'm going back to this movement to see how things are changing. And I can see, and you can probably see, that there's more movement now in her chest. Her ribs down below are moving. Her head is even rolling in a more organized way. Now interlace your hands and bring them behind your head. And by having Joy hold her own head in this way, I can do a simple movement of lifting her elbows and bending her neck. Now, I'm going to remove the cushion so that her head can go back toward the table a little bit more. And again, we're going to lift her elbows and sense her spine. In our imagination, think of the pelvis moving too, and the person's pelvis might be moving along and you may not be able to see it because all kinds of response is taking place in the nervous system. Now I'm going to lift your head a little bit and turn by moving the left elbow down, forward and down a little bit, and now the right one is going forward a little bit toward the ceiling and then down toward the pelvis. And so this movement of the arms is moving your head. Keep reducing the effort in your neck and notice how your head is being cradled by your hands and your arms. That's it. Okay, now take your hands out from behind your head. I'm going to return this little cushion behind your head. That's it. Every now and then we pause, we observe the person. She's breathing, I'm breathing. And now I'm going to go back to this movement. And sometimes we call this a reference movement because we're returning to it to see what kinds of changes are taking place. And you can probably see that her chest is folding more, and it's actually twisting and yielding as she senses her shoulders moving. Now I lifted her leg a little differently this time. So the last time I lifted her leg, I brought my hand behind her ankle and behind the knee, and I brought her knee up toward her chest. Now this time I'm giving her some added information. I'm placing my hand at her heel, and at the same moment that I begin to bend her knee, I'm actually, I wouldn't say pressing, but I would say staying in contact with the bottom of her foot and her heel, so that she starts to sense herself as standing on the foot, even though the foot's coming up toward her pelvis. And these kinds of subtle differences in handling create a novel experience for the nervous system. So by doing simply this, you see it's actually more like squatting, which is part of bending. So her knees come to her chest, and I'm supporting her foot, and then I'm going to let go. And this time, I'm going to take her arm across her chest so that we're creating what we call a contralateral movement. We're going across the midline, and now when her knee goes down, her shoulder comes forward, And when her shoulder goes back, her knee goes toward her chest. And I'm supporting her hand and her arm so she can reduce the muscular effort. Now we'll make a little circle. So this movement is a little more complex than the movement that we did earlier with the same side, hand on the same knee, same side knee, because we have this crossover, and it requires more movement in the rib cage, at least a different kind of movement. And the circles can be made in both directions. So you can see that it's this kind of movement that we're doing, and that's similar to walking. So this function that we're keeping in mind as we work has to do with bending, but it's actually going to translate to how she's walking as well. So within any functional integration lesson, we often have multiple functions, but we're thinking often of a particular way to organize the person as we're working. So again, my hand is holding her heel, supporting her foot. And this is a lovely feeling because it's unusual to have yourself moved by another person like this, where your hip joint's moving, your knee is bending, your ankle is bending. So you can imagine once again squatting and how that takes place with the bending of all the joints. And we only do a few movements. It's not necessary to do multiple repetitions. The nervous system is very intelligent, and small suggestions of movement make a very big difference. So let's see how Joy responds to having the shoulders lifted like that. And look at that. See the movements now going all the way down to her lumbar spine. You can probably see how easy that is now. I'm going to go back to lifting her upper back. And I can sense her spine moving now. Very little pressure. It's a gentle lift. Her spine is moving, and now I'm connecting the movement, the cervical spine to the lumbar spine, all the way down to the tailbone. And we don't use a movement like that to impose movement. So sometimes we lengthen, or we'll do a little rocking movement, and it's actually an integrative movement. So at the beginning of a lesson, we don't begin by rocking people because it can feel really abrupt and even jarring. So we wait until we know we're going to get a very fluid response in the skeleton. So now I'd like you to interlace your hands around your left knee. And now we're creating even a more complex movement because we have both hands, we have the shoulders, we have the leg, and I'm going to guide her. So I have hold of her wrist gently, she has her leg, and I can bring her shoulders forward in slightly different directions. So by tilting her Left knee to the left a little bit. Her right shoulder comes away from the table. And then we can move it back toward the table. So I'm sensing, monitoring the movement in her hip joint, her spine, her shoulders. I'm always observing the movement of her head, her neck. Can make a little circle. And the practitioner's self-use is a primary aspect of the lesson. So when I move my pelvis in a circle, she's sensing that movement throughout herself. So we often match the movement that we're creating with our student. Okay, and now rest your hands and arms. And interlace your hands the opposite way. And bring them around your knee. So if you're watching this and you don't understand functional integration all that well, one of the variations that we do is we have people interlace their hands habitually, and then non-habitually is just sliding the fingers over. And this creates, again, a novel experience in the nervous system. So we're waking people up. We're training them to be sensitive to their movements. And we're relying on the intelligence of the nervous system to create more and more efficiency. Okay, let go once again. Rest your hands and arms. And I'm going to sit down below her feet and put my hands around the ankles. My thumbs are in that spot just in front of the heels. And I'm going to gently create a line of force from my hands. But it's actually not just from my hands. So my feet are involved. My pelvis is moving. My spine also is moving as I sense this movement from her feet through the legs, the pelvis, the spine, all the way up to her head. Now I'm going to lengthen the legs. So I take hold of the top of the foot with my left hand and underneath the ankle at the heel with my right hand. So I have her whole leg in my hands, and as I lengthen, I'm stabilizing her ankle, and she senses her whole leg, her foot all the way up to her head. And my thumb, if I want to make the standing function more obvious to the nervous system, my thumb goes to the ball of the foot close to the outside, and I bring her ankle, her heel into a movement of standing on her left foot. And you'll see that I subtly turned her foot as if she were standing on it. Now I'm going to add a detail here that's not necessary for joy, but for some people, when you start to turn the foot, you'll see that you don't have the connection all the way up to the hip. And that can be uncomfortable because you can have too much movement in the knee without the movement the hip. So if you're aware of that, you might want to turn the whole leg. So you turn from the femur, or you kind of come up underneath like this, and turn the femur, the thigh, and the hip joint. And that creates a safety for the person's knee. You can lift the knee a little bit this way and go that way. Go back down here to the foot. And now another detail is that when you lift the foot, you want to do the lifting of the foot in a way that it corresponds to the knee and the hip joint. So there's a continuation of the lifting, the way she's organized. So halfway through, I don't want to turn it the opposite direction, because again, there can be stress in her knee. So I'm going to lift her foot, turn so that I'm moving the whole leg all the way up to the hip joint, and then I can lengthen, and you may see that the movement goes all the way up to her head, or I can push just in front of the heel, and that also goes all the way through the leg, the pelvis, the spine, up to her head. And at this point, you really could say, hey, and notice the difference between your left leg, your left side, and the right side, because there's going to be a prominent feeling of standing on the left leg for most people. Okay, so let's start slowly. My hand is on the front of her ankle, my right hand, my left hand's behind the heel, and I lift her foot in relationship to her knee, and I'm seeing as I go very slowly, does her hip joint move? Is her knee safe? And I would say it is, but I'm going to go through this process anyway to remind you and to make her feel absolutely secure. So we'll turn your whole leg in and let it come out like that, protecting your knee, and then differentiating from the greater trochanter. We'll go back to your right foot. Take hold of the foot in a secure way from the front and the back. Lift it in alignment with your knee. And now it is easier. So whether you need it or not, it's a lovely experience to have. And you can lengthen. And you can see that my feet are on the floor, and the movement comes from my feet all the way through my whole skeleton. Goes all the way up to her head. So again, we could leave the lesson as she's nicely organized now, and I could have her roll to her side and sit up, but I'm going to add another movement. So it's not necessary to do all of the variations that I'm demonstrating today, but I think it's interesting to see a full lesson and lots of possibilities. So now I'm going to bend her left leg and stand it. And I'm going to move that roller over so it's not in the way. So even adjusting rollers is part of the lesson, because I want her to sense the security of my movements and how I'm respecting her comfort. So now we have one leg long, her left leg is bent, obviously, her foot is standing, and I see that it's standing, she's fine, but it could even be better, it could be clearer. So by taking her knee a little bit outward and inward, she's finding, as I am, where is the ideal placement for her left leg to be bent with the foot standing. And then I can lift her leg like this and find out, is there an optimal place? So if I lift, and along with searching for the optimal place for her foot to be resting, she's getting the added benefit of the movement of her left hip joint, her pelvis, her spine. And look, when I bring her foot, her toes back to the surface of the table, by going slowly and paying attention to her foot, she pays attention to her foot. So we're accentuating how she uses her feet on the ground. And now her foot is much closer to her pelvis. The lower leg is actually more vertical. And now I'm going to do a movement of bringing her foot to the table and lengthening her spine. So everything we do has multiple perspectives. So this movement of, say, standing on the left foot is taking place simultaneously to her right leg completely resting. And this is an unusual sense, again, to experience. And it's going to contribute to standing tall and to walking. So not only will bending be easier, but standing and walking will be easier after this lesson. So now leave your leg bent like that for a moment. So of course I'm asking for her to cooperate with me. And in functional integration lessons, sometimes we ask the person to do much more than what I'm asking Joy to do with me today. But there are lots of different styles of working with people. Now leave your legs bent, and I'm going to prop up your left leg. There we go. And we'll explore this movement, your knee tilting to the left and to the right. And lifting your knee towards your chest and back down, and your toes are making contact with the table. And by making small, light movements, the nervous system becomes more interested in what's happening. Okay. Leave your knee like that for a moment. Let's see here. There we go. So I'm imagining what she might be feeling, and of course I can't know for sure because I'm not having the functional integration lesson. But practitioners, we've all had the lessons that we're giving in some way. So we sense and we observe and we connect and we can imagine the kind of response that's happening in the person that we're working with, and that informs us while we're working. And it actually gives us a great deal of pleasure because we can imagine what the person's feeling and sensing after, what's been taking place. So there is a tremendous joy of giving a lesson of this sort to another person. So let's go back to this movement. And you can see how solid you're feeling. So when I push through that spot just in front of the ankles and through the legs, your pelvis, your spine, and your head, there's a security and stability that I sense in your skeleton that I wasn't feeling before. I wonder if you're relating to that. Yeah? So now that I know her a little bit more, she knows me, I can bring her hand up like that, and I feel her responding. She's light and fluid as I bring her arm up overhead. And I want to lengthen. So I'm lengthening the right side of her torso and sensing the connection all the way down to her feet. So one of the things that we do when we're working is that we move our whole self. So I could lift her arm sitting, but by moving my whole self and standing on my own 2 feet, I can give her a sense of lightness and organization that I can't always give sitting down. So the practitioner's self-use is continuous and adaptive to what they want to convey to the person on the table. So even the movement of bringing the leg up and standing the foot is specific. So we roll the leg slightly, just slightly outward externally. And the foot and the ankle is moving with the knee and the hip joint. And we just slide the foot up, and the heel points toward the sitting bone. So there's a direct line for the foot and then the knee to come to standing. That makes the most sense, because when we're standing, our heels are actually meant to be, if we're standing tall, underneath our hip joints, which is pretty close to the center. And sometimes we stand like this, or we do different kinds of things, but when you find yourself standing with your feet underneath your hips, you feel the line of force from the hips through the spine all the way up to the head. And it's actually much easier to stand in that way. So now I'm lifting Joy's knees up a little bit toward her chest and back down again. And this goes back to the original idea of bending. But in any lesson, we have to be able to bend, and we have to be able to straighten up, to come up after bending down. So now she has this movement of bending and coming back, and bending and coming back. in lots of different ways, or reaching here or reaching there. Now please roll to your side and sit up. Either side. And take a moment to sense yourself sitting. Notice the weight on your pelvis. Sense your feet on the floor. And now I'm going to sit next to you. And I'm interested in this movement of looking down a little bit and then looking forward again. And now look down again. So I'm listening with my hands on her chest and on her back side, sensing the integration of the lesson. So ultimately, we would like all the different parts of the person's skeleton to be organized, in this case for looking down, and just look forward. That's it. There you go. And now I'm going to bring you up to standing. So we often touch I'm touching really lightly, the base of the skull, very, very lightly. So we never want to hold a person's head still. That's a very uncomfortable person for people. So we're trained to use the lightest touch and convey the strongest message. So this holding the back of the head and the cheeks a little bit like that. So she senses my touch, and then I move and she moves, and we come up to standing together. It's very, very light. And first of all, stand and notice how you're standing. And I have a sense of wanting to move you a little bit, turning, come back, so the hip joint goes back a little bit as you look down to the left, and now let's turn from the hip and look down to the right. That's it. And now keep your gaze forward more or less and look to the left and look to the right. Back to the middle. And now look to the left and look to the right. And now for experimentation, just bend down and notice how you bend as if you were going to pick up. Here, I'll give you some. In fact, let's repeat the first experiment where you just were bending over to pick up the cushion and notice how you do the movement. And what's that like for you? Easy. Feel easier? Uh-huh. Yes, you look surprised. Sure, do it again. And you can probably sense that your ankles are moving, your knees. You may not feel the specifics, but the overall movement is just easier. Yeah, and those of you observing can probably see that too. Now, there's one more thing that just came to my attention that I'd like to impart to you. So stand looking at me again and begin to look to the left. So when she begins to look to her left, she shifts her weight to her right leg. And so now I'm going to ask you, with my hands, shift to your left leg and turn, and notice what that's like. So you may sense that you stay longer when you do that movement. And come back, and now shift a little bit, that's it, to your right leg, and then come back. And now repeat that. Shift. There you go. And there you go. And now this turning movement relates more to how you would walk. So now start to take a step toward me. That's it. And just look forward now and feel the walking movement and how that's changed for you. And now turn and walk back toward the table and observe yourself walking. And what are you observing?
I observe my hip joints bend differently
Uh-huh.
already when I lean forwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I strongly sense my ankles in walking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good. So we never know what the person is going to report. And we're happy with anything they have to say. Because usually, like Joy, you can see that there's a brightness and there's a freshness, a rejuvenation in their face and their whole self. And the things that are prominent in their attention to themselves are often surprising. And that's a lovely aspect of giving Feldenkrais lessons, is that the practitioner is always surprised with what the person's learning on the table. So thank you. Thank you. And thank you.